Okay, so picture this. You're reading the news, right? And the headline's like, ultimatum. Dramatic, right? But get this. It's not some tense standoff with, like, a hostile country. It's the U.S. laying down the law to Israel. Talk about a plot twist. We are diving deep into this whole diplomatic mess today, and believe me, the fallout from this could be huge.
Yeah, it's not every day you see allies, especially allies as close as these two, resorting to ultimatums, right? I mean, what's really wild is how fast things went from the horror of those Hamas attacks to this, like, almost Cold War tension between the U.S. and
Yeah,
Israel.
no kidding. It's like we skipped ahead a couple chapters in the story.
Yeah.
One minute it's this horrific attack, the next it's like leaked letters and sanctions flying around, and
Yeah.
people are even talking about arms embargoes. It's crazy how fast it's all happening.
And that speed, that's part of what makes this whole U.S. ultimatum thing so, like, unsettling, you know? It's like firing a flare gun in the middle of a diplomatic dinner party. Impossible to ignore. So you've been digging into all this. Walk me through it. What exactly are Blinken and Austin putting on the table? Like, what do they want from Israel?
Well, first of all, just the fact that it's a joint letter from both of them,
Yeah.
that's already sending a message, right? Like, this isn't just some casual memo. And then on top of that, you've got the fact that it got leaked, which, come on, that doesn't just happen by accident.
Yeah.
Someone wanted to make sure the whole world knew what was being said.
It's about sending a very public message, for sure.
Exactly. They wanted to make a statement. And that statement, well, it comes with some pretty specific demands. Like, they want Israel to let in at least 350 trucks of aid into Gaza every single day.
Wow, 350. That's a lot.
Right. And they're not done there. They also want pauses in the fighting to make sure that aid actually gets delivered safely. And they want Israel to really think twice about those evacuation orders they gave to Palestinian civilians, basically saying, hey, are you sure about this?
And of course, we can't forget about that 30-day deadline they slapped on all of this, which, I mean, you and I both know that just so happens to be right after the U.S. election, which tells you this isn't just about humanitarian aid, right?
Oh, absolutely not. U.S. politics are definitely playing a role here. It's like they're trying to walk this tightrope. On one hand, they've got to uphold humanitarian principles, right? But on the other hand, they don't want to completely alienate a key ally. And all while keeping an eye on the polls back home?
Talk about a balancing act.
Seriously, it's tricky, to say the least.
And honestly, it might even be riskier than people realize. See, the U.S. has laws about this kind of thing. When it comes to humanitarian aid, they're pretty clear. If it even looks like Israel is getting in the way of that, even indirectly, it could have serious consequences. I'm talking about financial support here. And then there's the wild card in all of this.
Oh, right. We can't forget about Iran.
Exactly. Iran's always lurking in the background, and they've never exactly been shy about their feelings towards Israel, have they? A wider conflict, especially one where Israel is seen as, acting without any kind of restraint. Well, that could be all the reason Iran needs to make a move. And that's a whole other can of worms nobody wants to open.
It's starting to feel less like global politics and more like a pressure cooker about to explode.
And it's not just the U.S. turning up the heat either. It's like the whole world's got their eyes on Israel right now. And a lot of those eyes are not happy with what they're seeing.
It's true. We've got Britain over there. They haven't exactly been holding back either, have they? I mean, they straight up sanctioned those two Israeli officials, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir.
Yeah.
And not just like a slap on the wrist either. We're talking target and sanctions here, just for the things they've been saying.
Yeah, going after specific individuals like that, that's not subtle. That's a big deal.
Right. But then you've got France, and they're taking things even further.
Macron. Oh, he is not mincing words these days. He's actually talking about an arms embargo on Israel, which, let's be real, that would be a huge deal. And then there was that comment he made.
Wait, remind me about that. He was talking about some UN resolution, right? Something from way back. Help me out here. What was the significance of that?
Okay, so Macron brought up this UN resolution from like 1947. This was the resolution that basically paved the way for Israel to become a state.
Right. I remember that. But why is that relevant now?
Because Macron's not just reminiscing about history here. He's sending a message. He's basically reminding everyone that Israel only exists as a state because of international agreements and this whole global consensus that, yeah, this is a good idea. So when a major ally starts publicly questioning the legitimacy of your actions by bringing up that foundational moment, that carries weight, a lot of weight.
So he's basically saying, hey, Israel, remember, you're not above international law and all this stuff you're doing. There are consequences.
Exactly. And it's not just talk either. Remember how Britain, France, and Algeria all got together? They called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. And you don't do that unless you're really, really worried about where things are headed.
This is starting to feel less like a disagreement and more like a whole domino effect, you know?
Mhm.
Like the U.S. ultimatum was the first domino to fall.
And now everyone's watching to see what happens next.
Exactly. What happens to Israel if they just keep getting more and more isolated? What happens if their allies turn their backs on them?
That's the million-dollar question. And the answer, well, depends entirely on how Israel chooses to respond.
It's true. I mean, you'd think all this pressure, all these warnings, it would make anyone think twice, right?
Right. You'd think so.
But then you look at Netanyahu, and he doesn't seem to be backing down at all. It's actually kind of baffling.
Yeah, it's almost like he's doubling down, if anything.
Exactly. So, like, what's the strategy here? Why risk alienating your biggest ally, especially when things are already this volatile in the region? It's not like things were exactly calm before all this, you know?
Well, I think to really get it, we have to try to understand how Netanyahu sees all of this. He's been a major player in Israeli politics for a long time now. And for most of that time, he's been able to count on the U.S. like rock solid support.
It's that whole special relationship thing, right? Like this idea that no matter what happens, the U.S. is going to be there for Israel.
Exactly. And it's not just talk. At least until recently, that's been actual U.S. policy for decades. Remember when Biden said that thing? America will always have Israel's back. And he meant it too. That wasn't just a soundbite. It reflected this very deep-seated belief in the U.S. about, their duty to protect Israel.
So you think maybe Netanyahu's calling their bluff? Like he's betting that the U.S. won't actually go through with any of this, that it's all just tough talk.
It's definitely a gamble, that's for sure. A big one. But it might not be as crazy as it sounds. I mean, he knows things are really divided in the U.S. right now, and he's probably hoping that division will work in his favor. Plus, there's another thing we can't forget about.
Oh, right, the election. Talk about a wrench in the works. How do you think that plays into all of this?
It's huge, because if there's one thing Netanyahu understands, it's how U.S. politics work. And he knows that if Trump gets elected again, it could completely change everything.
Yeah, it's not like Trump was exactly known for being tough on Israel, was he?
Let's just say he was a lot more accommodating, to put it mildly. Don't forget, during his presidency, Trump pretty much always sided with Israel, even when his own advisors were telling him to maybe, pump the brakes a little, even when it meant causing tension with European allies or getting criticized by international groups. He didn't care.
So for Netanyahu, a Trump victory is like his get-out-of-jail-free card.
Yeah.
If he can just hang on long enough, he might end up with the U.S. back in his corner, no questions asked.
It's like a high-stakes game of chicken, and the stakes are incredibly high.
So basically, we're saying that a second Trump presidency on top of everything else that's going on.
Yeah, let's just say it could have some really serious consequences for the entire region, and not in a good way.
Okay, now I'm starting to get nervous again. So we're talking about potentially even more fighting, even more suffering, all because of political gamesmanship. I mean, come on.
And let's not forget, this isn't just about politicians moving pieces around a chessboard, There are real people caught in the middle of all of this. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is already awful, and it could easily spiral out of control if things get any worse.
It's easy to get caught up in all the political drama and forget that there are actual human lives at stake.
That's why it's so important to remember the human cost of all this. It's easy to talk about sanctions and ultimatums and political strategies, but we can't forget that every decision made in Washington or Jerusalem or Gaza, it has a ripple effect. And it's the ordinary people who end up paying the price.
This whole situation is giving me whiplash, I swear. 1 minute I'm trying to wrap my head around U.S. foreign policy. The next minute I'm thinking about the people who are literally caught in the crossfire. It's a lot.
It is. It really is. And that's exactly why we're talking about it, Because understanding how we got here, all the different players, what their motivations are, what the stakes are, that's the first step to figuring out a way forward.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about the U.S., we've talked about Israel, we've talked about what the rest of the world thinks about all this. But there's something you said earlier that really stuck with me. Something about how even in the middle of all this chaos, there's all this cold, calculated political strategy going on. What did you mean by that?
Well, remember that article we talked about,
Yeah.
the one that was trying to get inside Hamas's head, what their goal was in launching those attacks in the first place?
Yeah, you mean the idea that maybe they were hoping to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Israel? Like they thought if they could somehow get those two to turn on each other, it would somehow benefit them.
Exactly. Now, whether that was their actual plan or not, who knows? But it just goes to show you, even when it seems like there's just chaos and violence, there's always another layer. There are always people making calculated moves, trying to advance their own agendas.
So what you're saying is, even acts of violence can be a form of political strategy.
In a way, yeah. And whether Hamas meant to do it or not, the situation we're in right now, with the U.S. basically giving Israel an ultimatum.
Well, it shows you just how fast the balance of power can shift.
And how even the strongest alliances can start to crumble when things get rough.
Exactly. I mean, this whole thing has really thrown a wrench into how we usually think about the U.S. and Israel, right? We're so used to them being on the same page, presenting this united front.
Yeah, even when they disagreed behind the scenes, they always kept up appearances. This whole ultimatum thing, it's like they're airing their dirty laundry for the whole world to see.
It really is. And I think it says something about what's happening in global politics as a whole, you know? Like
Huh.
all the old rules, all the assumptions about who's aligned with who, it's all changing
Huh.
and fast. So if even the U.S. and Israel, with all their history, with everything they've been through together, if are having this kind of public blow-up, what does that mean for everyone else? For global alliances in general, like, can we even count on those partnerships anymore when things get tough? Or is it just like every country for themselves now?
It's a good question, and honestly, it's one we should all be asking ourselves. I mean, look around. You've got this resurgence of nationalism, this focus on me first, that's like eating away at the whole idea of global cooperation. And that's terrifying, especially when you think about the kind of problems we're facing. Climate change, pandemics, the threat of nuclear war. These aren't things any one country can solve on its own. It takes everyone working together.
It's like we're stuck in this weird paradox,
Yeah.
right? We need each other more than ever, but everyone's just drifting further and further apart.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? What can actually be done to, like, dial things down in the Middle East? And how do we stop it from dragging the rest of the world down with it?
Million-dollar questions, both of them. And the truth is, there's no easy answers. But if we want any chance of finding a way out of this mess, it has to start with diplomacy. It has to.
So you're talking about, like, the UN.
Yeah.
But let's be real for a second. Their track record isn't exactly stellar. I mean, they're famous for getting bogged down in bureaucracy, right?
Yeah.
And then there's those vetoes. Always some powerful countries shutting things down because it doesn't fit their agenda.
Look, you're right. The UN is far from perfect. It's this big, complicated machine. And yeah, sometimes it feels like it moves at the speed of molasses. And yeah, sometimes it feels like it doesn't get anything done. But for better or worse, it's the only real global forum we have for tackling these kinds of problems. It's the only place where everyone can at least try to come together and find peaceful solutions.
So we shouldn't write them off completely. There's still a chance they could actually help in this situation.
Look, diplomacy, even when it feels hopeless, is always, always better than the alternative. Because sometimes just keeping those lines of communication open, having a place where people can at least talk to each other, sometimes that's all it takes to create the space for something unexpected to happen, for things to shift just enough for a breakthrough.
Okay, I can get on board with that. But we're talking about some seriously deep divisions here.
Yeah.
Like, how do you even begin to build trust, to find some kind of common ground when there's this much anger and resentment flying around?
You're not wrong. It's a huge challenge. But I think the key is changing the equation for everyone involved. And that's where international pressure can make a real difference. Because even though the U.S. and Israel might be on shaky ground right now, they both still care what the rest of the world thinks. Nobody, no matter how powerful, wants to be the bad guy on the world stage.
So the more the international community comes together, the more they condemn the violence, demand humanitarian access, push for a real negotiated solution, the more likely it is that people in power will actually pay attention.
Exactly, because it changes the whole game,
Yeah.
Suddenly, it's not just about keeping your allies happy, it's about protecting your reputation, your credibility. It becomes a much bigger deal.
It's like some high-stakes game of poker, with everyone trying to figure out how far they can push their luck before the whole thing blows up in their face.
And that's what makes this whole situation so incredibly fragile. One wrong move, one impulsive decision, one miscalculation, it could have disastrous consequences. And not just for the Middle East either, for everyone.
It's definitely a lot to take in. And if I'm being honest, it's kind of overwhelming. It's
Yeah.
easy to feel helpless, you know? Like, what can any one person actually do in the face of something this big and complicated?
I get it, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, but don't underestimate the power of small actions. Educate yourself, talk to people, support organizations that are working towards peace, hold your leaders accountable. These things might seem insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but they matter. They really do.
So you're saying that change starts small, that even our individual choices can make a difference.
Absolutely. Big changes don't just happen overnight. They're the result of countless smaller actions, all adding up over time. Every voice raised, every conversation had, every act of courage, it all contributes to building a better future.
On that note, we'll leave you with this thought. Imagine you're in a position of power right now. What would you do? What steps would you take to try to de-escalate this conflict? What would you do to build a more peaceful and just future for everyone involved? It's a question worth thinking about, and even more importantly, it's a question worth acting on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.